Okay, so in the last lecture we talked about point, which is one of the basic elements of design. So now we're going to talk about line. A line is a series of points, so it makes sense to talk about line right after we talk about point. So if you haven't watched the point lecture yet, maybe go back and do that. Go back and watch that one first. None of these are super long or anything, so okay, where a point has no dimension, as we talked about before, that's why sometimes we call it a dot when we're referring to it in terms of mark making. A line has one dimension, right? So line is one of the simplest and most versatile elements of design. So again, you see this list of definitional type words. I'm not going to read to you because you can all read, you're college students, but whenever you see bolded words like this with definitions in the lectures, those words might pop up again in vocabulary quizzes. So those are good to keep an eye on. Okay, and here's just sort of an illustration of some of those definitions. So line as a point in motion emphasizes the unique dynamism of the line when we think about it in terms of that definition. The remaining three definitions emphasize its connective power. Basically, it's lighter and it's more fluid than any of the other design elements, and line thus adds kind of a unique energy to a design or to a work of art or to whatever you're using line in. The fundamental characteristic of a line is to connect or to unite. You have two dots, you connect them with a line. Makes sense, right? This connection can be visible or invisible, so it can be real or implied, which we're going to talk about a little bit. Simply by drawing a line, we can activate a space, define a shape, or create a compositional bridge between two areas. While dots or points are about position, lines are more about movement and about direction. A line leads somewhere, sometimes literally if you're following a line like as a directional line, if you're on an airplane and you see the lit up lines down the aisle to show you which way to go. But basically just a line is leading you somewhere, whether it's literally leading you somewhere or whether it's just leading your eye somewhere. Your eye moves along it seeking one or both of its endpoints. So when you see a line, you naturally look for its end. This movement and direction makes lines inherently dynamic. Dynamic means active, right? Each line has its own distinctive quality. The quality is largely determined by the line's orientation, direction, degree of continuity, and by the material used to create it. Okay, so orientation refers to the line's horizontal or vertical or diagonal position. So is it horizontal? Is it vertical? Is it diagonal? Diagonal and curving lines are generally the most dynamic. They're the most active. Horizontal lines typically are the most static, right? Vertical lines imply potential change, so they're a little bit more dynamic than, say, a horizontal line, but not as dynamic as a diagonal or curved line. Direction refers to the implied movement of a line. So which way does it seem like it's going? If we have a diagonal, we tend to think of it taking our eye upward or downward, right? Continuity or linear flow can enhance the direction. So continuity, is the line broken? Is the line continuous? That kind of thing. Okay, so here are some more related terms, and again, any of these that are bolded, you're going to want to go back and review. These slides are all available online for you, so you can go back and review those at your own pace, and then you'll be familiar with them for the vocabulary quiz. Okay, so when two lines join, like in the first image here, they create an angle between them. This joint or point of connection becomes the starting point to move in two different directions. So this basically, you're creating an angle, right? Multiple joints create a sense of altered direction. So if we see joined lines like this, and then another one adds, it seems like you're going this way, then you're going this way, then you're going that way, right? So they alter the direction as you add them together. When the angle between the lines is acute, meaning less than 90 degrees, the movement and change in directions is perceived to be more rapid than if it's, say, obtuse or greater than 90 degrees. Separating lines from each other focuses attention on the individual identity of each line and also on the interval or the blank negative space in between the lines. So that's a compositional change. When we have multiple lines, it creates tension between them and kind of activates the space between and around them. Changing the thickness or the weight of the lines also can change the composition and can alter how we perceive them and how we perceive them in relation to each other. It can also add emphasis if you have variance in terms of the thickness of each line. And it can also create a kind of sense of depth. Lines working together in a rhythm can form patterns and textures. Okay. A strong kind of match between the line quality and the expressive intent is essential. So the kind of line that you're creating is going to lend it its expressive quality, its expressive identity. In this example, we have Kevin Haran, and he's using vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines to map out the positions of various objects in a still life, right? So this is like a typical art classroom kind of still life. We have a lot of objects, we have a skeleton in there, we have some draped fabric, and he's going through and applying guidelines to sort of block out the composition that he's creating. Spheres, cones, and the detailed skull all become focal points in this kind of complex composition. The fluid lines animators Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnson use here express the movement and playful energy of this early sketch of the Mickey Mouse cartoon. So you can see how these are kind of more static, showing us where everything lays in relation to each other in the depth of the room, whereas these have this fluidity that makes them feel more active and more jovial and playful. Michael Mazur used a variety of lines in an overview of hell based on Dante's Inferno. You probably have to read Dante at some point. I don't know if you do it anymore, but maybe you've heard of Dante's Inferno. Okay, it's very famous. So as Dante describes hell, it's divided into 9 circles, right? That's why you have the 9 circles of hell that you've probably heard of, including limbo. There's gluttony, lust, greed, envy, wrath or anger, I think, maybe fraud, treachery, deception, something like that. Okay, so you have all these different circles. So he's representing these different circles of hell in a somewhat abstracted way, and he's doing this by defining them using different weights of line, different kinds of texture, and he's making the distinction without doing something super representational, right? It's just the quality of the lines that shows the distinction in the layers and the rings of hell. So this is using these kind of expressive brushstrokes. He's combining this with these textured kind of passages in the aqua tint, and then utilizing the negative space, the white spaces in between, to also create a kind of definition. This variety of lines helps distinguish the various levels and also activates the entire image, so it becomes a very active feeling composition. Actual lines, so remember we talked about invisible lines, so we have also actual lines and implied lines. Actual lines can describe forms simply and eloquently. Here we have A Study of Hands by Eleanor Dickinson. So she's presenting different views of hands using contour lines. Contour lines define the edges of a form, so you're not going into all the detail inside, you're just showing us the edges, basically. Here she distills the complex anatomy of hands down to a few simple lines, but we still get the idea, right? Next to her, we have Rico Lebrun. Rico Lebrun's gesture drawing of a hand captures the essential action. So it's not just the contour, we kind of get a sense of the movement with the way he shaded it and the way he's illustrating the hand. So he captures all the essential action and movement of the hand rather than describing every detail. In gesture lines, the focus on what the hand is doing rather than what the hand is, or whatever you're drawing. It's kind of a gesture captures kind of a lightness and movement. Rembrandt, one of the most famous historical artists of all time, So Rembrandt often used economical lines to describe spheres and cylindrical volumes from which figures are made. So you can see in this gesture drawing, Rembrandt, a master who could portray things very realistically, is doing his undersketching and is just kind of catching the very simple sort of essence of shapes by using gesture drawings and using gestural expressive line. Okay, so let's see. Calligraphic lines, so calligraphy, can add more energy to a drawing or to a design. Here, Sotatsu and Koetsu use variations in line weight and continuity to suggest the graceful motion of the bird. So this is the image on the left. And then on the right, we have a much more contemporary version with Gu Gan, who is providing this kind of combination of calligraphy and the historic art of calligraphy in combination with delicate line drawing and then also these wide kind of bold brush strokes. So we have at least 3 different kinds of line quality making up this composition. Okay, if we skip back, let's go backward really quick to Héron's drawing. We can see how artists use organizational lines to build their linear kind of skeleton on which the rest of the composition comes through. So you can kind of see these guidelines. You can see if you look at the little edge of the stage that the skeleton is on, you can see the line extends out into space. So these are lines just kind of showing us where things are in relation to each other. That's a technique that I teach in drawing, and a lot of people teach in drawing and utilize in drawing, putting in these kind of guidelines to show how things relate to each other on the page to kind of help it help you capture what's happening in the 3-dimensional world on a 2-dimensional page. Okay, so here in Alfred Leslie's The Killing Cycle, we can see an underlying framework. So you can see there's these arrows have been superimposed on top of this painting to give you an idea of the kind of lines that are making up the composition, okay? So we can see this underlying framework. You can really see it because I've overemphasized it, right? We have a dead man and a diagonal board. He's connecting a single woman in the lower left-hand corner, so we have that connection right there that's quite dynamic. And the dead man on the board is connecting the woman in the lower left to the 4 figures that are in the upper right. A horizontal line supports them, so that's kind of creating a stabilizing balance there. And then their bent legs, their bent knees and arms create all of these dynamic kind of lines in the composition that make it very interesting and move our eye completely all around. This adds a lot of energy, while the horizontal line there is for kind of a landing place for our eye, so we have a focus and we have some stability as well. Okay, so that's all actual lines. Lines can also be implied rather than actually drawn. So this is what I'm talking about with like the invisible line and its role. Because implied lines simply suggest the connections, the viewer becomes actively involved in the compositions that use this type of line. So we have a natural inclination in the way our brains work with our eyes to finish information. If you've ever seen one of those things on Facebook or online where it says, if you can read this, you're very intelligent, blah, blah, blah. And it's something where they've just taken all the vowels out of a sentence and your brain will just fill it in and complete it for you. It's the same kind of thing. Our brains tend to fill in missing information. So you can easily look at these dots and your brain will create for you a spiraling line, okay? So we see that kind of natural inclination in our brains applied in compositions pretty regularly, and it's a good thing to understand as an artist. This is Minor White in their work Sandblaster. The white arrow, right, implies a connection between the numbers in the foreground and the worker's helmet. So we have this kind of implied connection between them. And this human inclination to connect fragmented information, we call that closure. So this wanting to connect things, to pull things together, is closure. Okay, this is another very famous artist, Caravaggio, and then here's just a simple contour kind of breakdown of what's happening in this image. This is the deposition by Caravaggio. It's the Christ being removed from the cross. Okay, so this uses closure extensively. Caravaggio is famous for using these very, very dark backgrounds, this very high contrast light highlighting with very dark backgrounds, right? Chiaroscuro. So this utilizes, for this to work, he has to rely on the viewer, on our brains, to use this concept of closure to fill in the information we don't see, because his figures get kind of absorbed into the background. So even without complete continuous lines, as you can see when we break down what's happening with the actual contours of the image on the right here, our brain will still put this picture together. So this is a very solid use of implied line, and particularly of shadow. So we have all these gaps in the actual image because of the intense shadow, but our brains can figure it out, right? So used skillfully, this loss of definition becomes a strength, and it makes works that are more interesting and more vital in a lot of ways. So connections made through closure can stimulate the viewer and stimulates the viewer's imagination to fill in the rest of the information, and you then have an active participant in your work. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of different techniques that utilize line particularly. In dot last time I mentioned stippling. Stippling is where you make lots of little dots to create value and texture. So here, one of the main techniques we use is called hatching. So hatching is where you make lots of lines that are parallel together and are various distances from each other. And it produces a range of grays. It produces a range of values simply by putting your hatch lines closer together or further apart. And these are straight parallel lines. An even wider range of value can be achieved with cross-hatching, which is exactly what it sounds like. You make your parallel lines and then you hatch in a different direction over them. So you're layering intersecting hatch lines. That's cross-hatching. Villon, Jacques Villon, he's the brother of Marcel Duchamp. Those of you who like art history, Marcel Duchamp is very, very famous. This is his older brother. So he uses hatching and cross-hatching here in this portrait of the very famous poet Baudelaire. So you can see how it divides the head into a series of faceted planes. When you take drawing, this is something that you'll study, is how the face can be created in these faceted sort of planes and broken down. Okay, so we have hatching, we have cross-hatching. Another tool that we use that utilizes an understanding of line is called cross contours. Cross contours create an even more powerful kind of illusion of three-dimensionality. So in this one example I have on the left, this is an actual three-dimensional piece. It's sort of difficult to photograph. It's kind of hard to see what it is, but this is a sculpture, a representation of a human head made out of clothes hangers. So these are wire clothes hangers that have been bent into the form of the human head, and then the hook part that you use to hang it in your closet is left in its original form, sticking out. So that's a very literal bending wire to conform to the shape that you want to represent in the human face and stacking it. So if you think of those clothes hanger lines, that's how cross contour is when we use it, when we draw lines. So it's like drawing lines like that are like they're mapping the surface of the object or whatever it is you're portraying. Okay, so we also see an example of this in Michelangelo, of course, very famous Michelangelo, Sistine Chapel, the David, all that stuff. So this is one of his drawings where you can see he's using cross contour, and then he's also using hatching, and he's using cross hatching. So he's using all three of these techniques together to create this head of a satyr that he's showing us. Okay, linear networks, that's what we call these things, hatching, cross-hatching, cross-contour, those are all called linear networks, where you're making lots of lines together. So a bunch of dots together is called an array, a bunch of lines together is called a linear network. And they also play an important role in abstract work, in more abstract and conceptual work. For example, here we have Sarah Mast. This is a detail shot, and then the smaller image is the full image. So she is fascinated by humanity and humanity's connection to the stars. Basically, the idea that all of us as carbon-based life forms are made out of the same stuff as the stars and planets and cosmos. So she makes a lot of work that is based in kind of showing similarities in how neuronetworking works in the human mind and how cosmic astrology and things, not astrology, astronomy and things work. So our bodies and the stars, made of the same things, work that connects that's sort of abstract, uses a lot of line, uses dots. Okay, so in Orion's Gift, which is what this is, Orion is a constellation, so here she's connecting the branching growth of biological forms, particularly our neuronetworking cells in our brains, with the atomic particles in the constellation. And she's making that connection by using line and by using dot. Okay, next we'll talk about shape.